Welcome to this video entitled rather grandiosely, The United States and the World. So in this video we're going to describe the actions that the USA took in the period, in particular focusing on the Pacific and Latin America, explain what impact it would have had and how successful they were, and whether they abandoned isolationism and whether they've turned towards an imperial goal. So, as a quick introduction, between 1865 and 1890, it's predominantly defensive. It uses the Monroe Doctrine to effect in different areas. When we look back and we look at Canada, we look at Mexico, etc., it's very defensive reaction. Whereas this period is very much about naval expansion, a war with Spain, annexation of territory, and expansionist growth. Now, as a reminder, we've got the scale on the right-hand side. We've got expansionists such as Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, Alfred Mahan, and these people saw America on a civilizing mission across the world, that they were going to spread the New World ideas into Latin America and other places. Now, on the other hand, the other side of the population, with individuals like W.J.B. Bryan, Carnegie, Grover Cleveland, Gompers, etc., these individuals very much favour isolation and reaction if necessary. Woodrow Wilson takes this to the next degree, and we'll look at him in a separate video for World War One. Now, America in this period are very much categorised by isolationists and expansionists, and these two groups are really going to go to war with each other when trying to solve international disputes. So all of the time it's Congress and it's these individuals that are playing off against each other to try and get what they want. Now, the Pacific is one theatre that America wants to increase and expand into, but it's going to introduce a problem with Spain. Now, the Pacific, as we can see, the United States, it is on the trading routes towards China and Japan, which are big markets for America, and of course it means access to South America, etc. Now, Eastern Samoa, between 1865 and 1890, this is the actions that we see. Eastern Samoa, they're offered a naval base in 1872, it's refused. But we see increased expansion from Germany, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal in this period, the European powers, and that threatens American security. So after a civil war in Samoa in 1898, the USA and Germany support different sides. This leads to the USA establishing a protectorate over Eastern Samoa, sometimes called American Samoa, and Germany actually taking the other side of Samoa as a colony. So this is the first piece of action that we have. America initially in 1872 refuses to have anything to do with it, but eventually takes it under its wing as a protectorate. In Hawaii in 1898, the USA annexes it in 1898 as in its important stopping station. US missionaries set there to spread their message, and eventually it becomes dependent on US trade. The McKinley Tariff in 1890 actually goes against this, and it puts import duties on the sugar. Of course, Hawaiians suffer. The civil war that happens afterwards allows the USA to support the correct side and later annex it as part of a territory. So in this incident, we see an expansionist kind of approach being taken. Now, the Philippines, we'll talk about in a bit more detail after we look at the war with Spain, but this is perhaps the ultimate imperialist endeavour that America undergoes. It purchases it for $20 million. There is huge opposition to this within the Philippines. It leads to war, and it's very quickly over and done with. The Philippines eventually subjugate to American rule. By 1904, there's 126,000 troops are stationed there. Eventually, they're starting to withdraw. But the Philippines is part of Americans' overseas territory, and you can see the distance. Hawaii, okay, you can understand that. The Midway Islands, Samoa, but the Philippines is on the other side of the world. Now, in Latin America, you can argue that this is within the sphere of influence as defined by the Monroe Doctrine. Puerto Rico is the first incident. It's acquired from Spain in 1898. It's developed with the Organic Act, and Puerto Ricans are given US citizenship in 1917. Cuba, again, is a consequence of the Spanish-American War in 1898. It's further developed by something called the Platt Amendment that we'll go into more detail soon, and eventually US forces go in to support revolutionaries in 1906. The Dominican Republic is another incident in Latin America. By 1905, under Theodore Roosevelt, US Marines are sent in. Nicaragua becomes a US protectorate in 1912. And Panama, which we will look at in more detail. Again, support is given for independence. And that really is based around the Panama Canal. By 1903, they acquire land legally after the Panamerians gain their own independence from Colombia. And of course, the Panama Canal is completed by 1914. And lastly, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony, but after the war with Spain that America were victorious in, the Spanish withdrew. The Organic Act of 1900 allows them to be administered by the USA. And Venezuela. 1895, Britain and Venezuela enter in a dispute over borders with British Guiana. Cleveland demands that Britain arbitrate. The USA threatens to send ships to the dispute, and Britain backs down. So again, this is a piece of intervention. This is on their back doorstep, and it's to stop the the European powers from gaining any kind of ground in Latin America. And America actually threatens war by sending ships to the dispute. Now, Cuba is really the catalyst for war with Spain. It's within the sphere of influence. It's 70 miles off the coast of Florida. It's been controlled by Spain, but the Cuban nationals want independence. There is a revolutionary war. Spain offers the rebels concessions, but it isn't enough. They want full independence. America initially stands off and keeps a distance from this. But there are three big incidents that causes them to become involved, and sort of two longer term reasons for it. A private letter is sent from the Spanish minister is stolen and published, and it slates America and kind of motivates the public in support of it. McKinley is accused of being a weak bidder for the admiration of the crowd, and again standoffish and not being involved. And lastly, we've got the main incident. It's a US battleship that mysteriously explodes. 266 people are killed. The USA claims that it's a mine. Spain claims it's an accident. Either way, it inflames US opinion and motivates the USA to support war with Spain. It's later independently verified that it was likely to be an accident and problems with the type of US ship that was being used. Long-term causes. The USA, there was fears that the USA would not be able to control an independent Cuba, and of course an economic interest. There is thousands of American jobs in Cuba on the sugar plantations. Cuba is solely reliant on American trade, and it becomes perhaps a distraction from the depression of the 1890s. A good war always solves a good depression. The Spanish War in 1898 is actually a relatively short fought war. It begins in April and it's over by August. The US launch a double attack on Spanish territories. The Navy attacks the Spanish in the Philippines and defeats the fleet, while the rest of the Navy blockade in two places to stop any additional troops from arriving. 17,000 American troops land, and within 3 weeks there is surrender, with the loss of just 379 US military members, although 5,000 will later die due to dysentery. The Treaty of Paris is signed in August. Cuba gains independence. However, a piece of land that later becomes known as Guantanamo Bay is given to the US as a military base. Spain loses the last part of its empire to the USA. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, the USA agrees to purchase the Philippines for $20 million, and Spain give the USA Guam, the territory. Now, from 1901 to 1912, there are incidences that show that the Spanish-American War really motivated Americans to seek an expansionist kind of approach. Cuba, we have in 1901 the Platt Amendment being introduced. That gives them confidence to be protected by the USA, and again, over the period we see increasing ties to the USA. In Panama, as we talked about, the Panamerians wanted their own independence. They wanted to be able to build the Panama Canal. That means you can journey between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and it is eventually supported by America. They gain independence, they sell them the land, and it's completed in 1914. In Nicaragua, we've got an anti-American president in 1909. attempting to stop US interest in mining. President Taft sends in the Marines, a new president is installed, and the country supported with loans. What better example can you have from such a different policy from protectionism and isolationism from the 65 to 90 period? And lastly, Dominican Republic. When they default on loans, Roosevelt uses his big stick to control customs revenue and eventually pays the loans in total. Now in the Far East, we have some developments in China. The Secretary of State John Ha introduces an open door policy, which means we will respect all trading rights in China. So rather than there be further conflict of the European states with the large market of China, they will respect each other's. Now there's a Boxer Rebellion where a small number of US troops are sent in to assist other countries in their extraction of their citizens, but in terms of Middle East expansion is very little. Japan, however, there is more substantial problems. There are substantial numbers of Japanese immigration into Hawaii and the USA, even if it is stopped in 1900 by legislation. And of course, Japan threatens the Philippines through proximity. And this is intensified when Japan defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Roosevelt decides to arbitrate and negotiate the end of the war. Japan is given free hand in Korea, whereas Russia does not have to pay reparations to Japan, and that's a sticking point for the Japanese. Better relations are achieved by 1908, however, with the Root-Takahara agreement to respect interests in China. So overall, we've got this isolationist policy to begin with from 65 to 90, from 90 to 1898 until the Spanish-American War. We kind of have this expansion and protection, but it's very limited in the Latin America and the Pacific area. From 1901 to 1912, we've got serious expansion in Dominican Republic, in Cuba, etc. And we've got developments in the Far East as well. So overall, we have a real categorically different approach to what was taken by American presidents from 1865 to 1890. And of course, it's where we get the different types of foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt with his big stick and talking softly. And we're going to look at President Wilson's approach with a moral authority much later in the next video. Thank you very much.